Happy Pride Month, everyone! It's the month where we get to put rainbows everywhere to celebrate our continued existence on this fragile planet. And as is the tradition with Pride Month, I had no idea what video I was going to make about it. But then, something caught my eye. As is the case when a massive superhero movie releases, Twitter wouldn't stop talking about Across the Spider-Verse, and in particular queer and film Twitter latched onto the key idea that Gwen Stacy was one of the transgenders. Naturally, as is always the case on Elon Musk's Hell app, this prompted a bunch of responses from people who decided that, no, Gwen can't be transgender, no. And I'm sorry, but y'all are the dumbest people alive. She is the most transgender aesthetic I've ever seen and has a protect trans kids sign in her room, and her father wears a trans pride pin. Gwen's trans. But putting aside this endless debate, there's a far more interesting question here, because at the end of the day, even though the evidence is overwhelming, Gwen is never outright stated to be trans in the film or by the creators, and while that doesn't mean this theory about her being trans is without merit, it has a lot of merit, it does mean we can't definitively say whether or not she is, and that opens up the question. Is Gwen Stacy a viable and good example of queer and specifically trans representation? This question even extends beyond this endless debate, as if you look at Across the Spider-Verse through the lens of queer theory, Gwen's story fits almost perfectly with the trans experience. She hides her true identity from her father, she's outed against her will, and her father has a negative reaction to it. She tries to isolate herself in order to prevent feelings of sadness and fear, and her whole journey in the movie is trying to look for people who accept her. It's a very archetypical allegory for the trans experience. And considering the aesthetic of those scenes between her and her father, I wouldn't be surprised if this allegorical connection was intentional, regardless of whether or not Gwen herself is canonically trans. So then, does that allegorical connection to the trans experience make a good representation? Well, that opens a huge can of worms that leads to the debate between queer stories and queer representation, and whether queer stories serve that role. Some film analysts and fans argue it does serve that role, and even that it serves that role better than a token gay character in a Nick at Night sitcom. And I'm not here to say that isn't a valid argument. For instance, there are queer stories that feature prominent queer characters like Everything Everywhere All at Once and The Owl House that I would consider representation, as their queer stories are explicit in their themes and the queerness of the characters factors into the plot. But then there's other examples of media that have queer stories but don't contain queer characters and keep their queerness to the subtext, even if it is very obvious. For instance, does The Matrix count as queer representation? It's a very famous example of a queer story, and the allegory is extremely prominent within the narrative, yet it still doesn't really qualify for me for a couple of reasons. Number one is the fact that, aside from the underlying story, there is nothing inherently queer about The Matrix. The aesthetic doesn't bother with the queer aesthetic, but instead is draped in greens, blues, and blacks, aka generic action movie colors, and the romance is the most cookie-cutter, straight romance in action moviedom. The Matrix is a queer story, but it is not queer representation because nothing about the movie itself inherently puts queerness in the spotlight. It's important to tell queer stories, sure, and there should be more of them, but ultimately a queer story means nothing if the audience can't see us as prominent and beneficial members of society. It is important in queer representation for the queers to be represented, which is not the case in The Matrix. I mean, if it was, you wouldn't have everyone on the right talking about being red-pilled, considering how obvious of a symbol that is. In this way, the Wachowskis themselves are honestly more significant as rep than The Matrix itself, being that they are the only trans directors prominent enough to be able to make these mega blockbusters even unto today. They represent how the queer community can be powerful in Hollywood, just as anyone else can, which movies like The Matrix don't do themselves. In this way, Gwen in Across the Spider-Verse is this weird gray area because, like The Matrix, its trans story is largely allegorical, and Gwen's trans status as a character is a little ambiguous. However, unlike The Matrix, Gwen's story is far more draped in queer aesthetic due to the large amount of trans iconography and the color scheme of those scenes with her dad. You can try to tell me that those colors are meant to be similar to her costume, but that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny when considering blue and pink aren't the primary colors of her costume. They're black and white. But you know what blue and pink are the primary colors of? The trans flag. Yeah. And so we're at an impasse because Gwen's trans status is left semi-ambiguous. The movie never goes that far. Possibly because of censorship issues, but also possibly because Gwen being trans isn't really important to the overall story. The trans allegory is an allegory, but Gwen being a trans woman herself isn't exactly essential to either her struggles or Miles, much less the overall plot. And here's where I think the queer community needs to jump in, because headcanon is a powerful thing. If it's loud enough, it can completely shape the trajectory of how wider culture perceives a character, and I think this is a perfect opportunity to do that. If we adopt Gwen Stacy as the trans Spider-Woman, then with enough time, she will be seen as that, unambiguously. The intentions of the story are vague enough that there isn't anything to suggest that she's not trans, and it seems like the filmmaker's intentions are for you to get the idea that she's trans, even if it's never outright stated. So this headcanon has a lot of merit, more than most, and I think this is an opportunity the queer community should take advantage of. If the artists aren't going to outright make her trans, then we can, and maybe then future trans kids will look at Gwen Stacy and not just see her as another Spider-Person, but as their Spider-Person who can help them find themselves. Fictional characters are important in that way. This is a chance for the trans community to be seen in a very prominent and popular character. And if we adopt her as representation, then maybe a generation of kids will grow up with Gwen Stacy, trans icon. Thanks for watching. If you wish to support me, you can do so on Patreon with either the $5 or $10 tiers. In addition, please like and subscribe. It helps out this video a lot in the algorithm, I think. Anyways, bye!